I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society. And if we lose that...
As you might imagine, you've been a topic of conversation on this campus a lot in the past week or so, certainly among a lot of us who discuss politics. And one of the things that sort of united people who like and dislike a lot of your ideas is that we appreciate your defense of free speech, and we appreciate you coming here to talk about it with us. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is Professor Van Dyke addressed the distinction between you and Jonathan Haidt. And you mentioned this as sort of a temperamental one. And I think, I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I noticed you've made a lot of more sort of substantively inflammatory claims. Like in the course of this lecture, you called the authors of Facebook posts demons and totalitarians. In past events, you've called them things like neo-Marxists, cultural Marxists. You've called them, I believe, a fifth column that is committing treason against the West. And it seems to me this is more than temperamental. This is a substantive difference. And
it's a substantive difference,
and,
yes.
And another thing you've done is that, unlike Haidt, you have a more sort of comprehensive political program. You've talked a lot in defense of traditional hierarchies, both of gender, of class, so on, though emphatically not of race. And so it seems that...
I haven't talked about defense of traditional hierarchies in terms of gender and class. That's not true.
Well, you've talked about hierarchies in society. You've talked
about that's true. I have done that, but I haven't justified them on the basis of gender and class. Whatever it was,
okay,
categories.
you talk
not
about,
okay. That's an important distinction.
Okay, but you defend hierarchies in society in a way that... You talk a lot about the Pareto distribution, yes?
That doesn't mean I defend it.
Well, okay.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think you talk
Observing that something exists is not the same as defending it. How in the world...
Well, people attack it, right?
What's that?
And you don't. People attack it.
Attack
inherently, attack the hierarchies of society as inherently unjust, right?
Well, they're unjust, but they're also useful.
Okay, so you say they're useful. Some
well,
people would disagree
look at
with
it
that
this
proposition.
way. Okay, look at it this way. You obviously think that it's worthwhile to stand up and ask a question.
Yes.
So you think that standing up and asking a question is better than not standing up and asking a question.
Yes.
Okay, that's a hierarchy.
Yes.
Of values.
Yes.
Okay, without the hierarchy of values, you couldn't act.
Of course.
No, not of course.
Well, wait.
It's partly why I'm
I
defending the hierarchy. Without a hierarchy, there's no impetus to act.
Hierarchy, right?
What's that?
There is a hierarchy in society, right?
No, there's multiple hierarchies in society.
Okay, there are multiple hierarchies in society, right?
Yes.
And you say that they are based in, you invoke the lobster, right? That they are based in nature.
Yes. I said that they were inevitable.
Yes, that they were inevitable. Some people disagree with that.
That doesn't mean that they're good.
But my point is that, this is generally relevant to it, you have a broader point than free speech. This is one of the things you talk about, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Whereas I think there are some other activists who focus on more exclusively
I'm not
on
an
free
activist.
Speech. There are some other individuals who engage in public political speech. Okay.
Yeah.
Who focus more exclusively on free speech, whereas you have other goals in mind. But one of the things that your more inflammatory language, and it's fair, it's a substantive disagreement, has done, I think, is it's politicized this free speech to an extent that someone like Haidt hasn't. I've noticed that when someone hears the term free speech now, they associate it with a specific set of thinkers, often as viewed as on the extreme right. And I think arguably that's the problem of all factions in society, because free speech should be a universal value. Polls certainly suggest that it's coming under increasing threat from both sides. But I suppose the heart of my question, in addition to, of course, these other observations, is that do you believe free speech is your primary end, or do you believe these other points you're making are important? Because I've heard you a bunch of times defend free speech sort of contextually, like you've complained about some of the laws in Canada that you dislike, that they institutionalize false facts into the law. But it seems to me that an absolutist defense of free speech makes no preference as to true or false. The point is that's something you are being forced to say something. It would be as bad as if you were forced to say something that is true, because the point of free speech is that you can say whatever you want, right?
No, the point of free speech is so that you can think your way through life without running headlong into a brick wall.
I think the politicization of free speech is by far the biggest threat to free speech, because this is always been
the radical leftists are the biggest threat to free speech.
So this is disagreement.
But I get your point.
The professor alluded to in previous questions, the substantive threats to free speech in much of the world, in Europe certainly, I think in the United States as well, from the government have come from the radical right. And I think it's fair to say that on the specific narrow subset of certain departments on liberal arts colleges, it's fair to say a threat comes from the left, though its scope is in dispute. But my question is, do you think that the way you talk about free speech, the way you link it to specific issues, the way you use inflammatory language, and the way you seem to make it, you seem to defend a specific set of free speech. There are certainly plenty of instances of free speech attacked on the other side that you don't mention as much. Do you think you risk politicizing this? Because it seems to me
yes.
that... Okay, and do you not think that's a far greater threat? Because, for example, the NRA... Well, sorry, the NRA is a group in the United States that defends guns rights, right?
Okay, hold it.
Yes.
It. We need a question.
Yes. Okay.
I mean, like I said, you're doing fine, but it's just too much.
Yes.
Like, I can't keep it straight.
Do you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized, and I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, there is a time, even when you're detached in some sense from the political realm, that you can't be detached anymore. Well, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true, you know, but I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. And I'm not happy with the radical left. And so if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So have I conducted myself perfectly? It's like, undoubtedly no. So I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them. But I'm muddling through. No. You don't get it. The devil's in the details. You work it out now when you formulate your restrictions on free speech. You don't shunt that off into the future. Who defines hate?
So wouldn't you say that the attempt to claw back or the right of freedom of speech isn't so far absolute as instrumental, and based on that, therefore, there are some cases where freedom of speech of some individuals can be curtailed if we want to get the better appreciation of the Logos and a better inclusion of more voices that are currently being shut out as a result of the extremity and radicalism of those select few. Wouldn't you say that's the case? Thank you.
Well, there's a very simple answer to that, which is yes. I'm not an admirer of hate speech laws, but that doesn't mean that I'm naive enough to think that there's no such thing as hate speech. So obviously, if you've ever been involved in an extremely serious argument, you know perfectly well that there's such a thing as hate speech, because you've probably uttered some. So there's also no doubt that there are forms of speech that are utterly reprehensible, and some of those are actually already punished by law. You can't incite to violence, you can't libel someone, right? So we have some restrictions already on what's acceptable discourse. Whether it's the case, typically speaking, that some people have more privileged access to free speech than others, well, that's obviously the case. I mean, that's part of power. And power is one of the means by which people climb hierarchies, although the more you can climb a hierarchy by exercising power, the more that's an indication of the fact that that hierarchy has become corrupt. So there's no doubt that these structural impediments to the free exchange of discourse exist. There's also no doubt, as you already laid out, that that's not in everyone's best interest, because what you want, if you have any sense in your society, and this is also why I think that we've put proper emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, is that you want everyone's logos to have the opportunity to clarify the unknown and reconstitute the world. And if you shut that down, then you risk getting access to the unique insights that that individual might bring. Okay, so I agree with your diagnosis completely. And I think that, you know, even in the West, to ignore the fact that many of our hierarchies tilt towards tyranny and that prejudice still exists in multiple forms is a mistake, although it's only one factor among many and shouldn't be identified as the primary causal determinant of each individual's life. I think that's a dreadful error. The question is, what do you do about it? And the devil's in the details. And as I said already, I'm not an admirer, for example, of hate speech laws, even though there's plenty of hateful speech, because I think the best thing to do is to leave free speech alone as much as you possibly can. Not because that will result in the perfect conditions for free speech, but because anything else that you're likely to do is going to make it worse rather than better. You know, if you look across the world, most societies don't do a good job of either promoting or allowing free speech. I don't know how we ever managed it. It's so unlikely because it's so hard on people and hard on those who occupy positions of power in tyrannical hierarchies that I can't believe that any society's ever managed to figure it out at all. So those dangers are always there. And I also think the highest likelihood often is that societies that do put high value on free speech will lose that because it's so difficult to maintain. So, but with regards to hate speech, for example, let's say that things would be much better if there was less hateful speech. It's like, seems highly probable to me, especially if you look at the more egregious forms of hateful speech. How best to regulate it? Well, my sense is you let those who wish to utter hateful things do so and let everyone hear them, because that's the best way to ensure that what they're saying will be understood and rejected. Now, in order to posit that, you have to assume that the population composed of sovereign individuals is wiser than it is foolish. That's a hope. You might think about it as an axiom of faith, but I do believe it to be the case. I think that if you put the evidence in front of people, by and large, they will do the right thing. I think that the problem with regulating hate speech, it's very simple. Who defines hate? And the answer to that is, over any reasonable period of time, exactly the people you would least want to have define hate. And so the consequences of the regulation become incalculably worse as a problem than the problem that they were designed to deal with. It's like, well, we have a problem, hate speech. Well, we can come up with a solution and there will be no problems with that solution. It's like, no, that isn't how the world works. You know, when I'm negotiating with my clinical clients, one of the things I always tell them is, often, because they're in difficult circumstances, and often not for psychological reasons, it's like, no, you don't understand. You're screwed both ways. You don't have an option here where you're not going to suffer. That's what it means to be in a bad situation. You're going to pay a price both ways. You can pick your price. Okay, so we're going to have hate speech, or we're going to have the consequences of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech. Well, I know what the consequences are of the arbitrary regulation of hate speech, is that things get a lot worse because hate's very difficult to define. And that's actually a real problem when you're trying to regulate it, because you have to be able to define it. And we're already at a point where, well, you made someone uncomfortable. Why isn't that hate speech? I mean, I was basically asked that by one of your most outstanding journalists, or your most popular journalists.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot.
Well,
I'm very glad that I have exercised my freedom of speech.
You get my point. It's like, you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
and that is what you should do. But you're exercising your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you, as far as I'm concerned.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head.
Well, why should you have the right to say something that's offensive? It's like, we can think that through. Let's think that through for a minute. So, I mean, my riposte to her, essentially, although this wasn't directly it, was, that's not a very smart question for a journalist to be asking, right? Because of all people who should never ask that question would be stand-up comics, right? And journalists. Because that's all they ever do. That's what it means to be a journalist, is to ask a question that's going to be offensive to someone. Who the hell wants to hear about what you've discovered unless it's about something contentious and important? So it was a jaw-dropping question as far as I was concerned. And the fact that it was a jaw-dropping question was part of the reason why that video went viral. Okay, so now let's think about offensiveness as part of hate. Okay, so the first thing we might say is that you really need to think when you have a difficult problem. And a difficult problem is one where there's something at stake. It might be your life, it might be your well-being, but and then we might say, well, there's going to be a diversity of opinions about that particular conundrum if it actually happens to be difficult. And so even to discuss it, because if you discuss it, you're going to discuss option A, it's going to annoy all the people who want option B, or you're going to discuss option B, and that's going to annoy all the people that want option A, and maybe there's 10 options. So if you're going to discuss anything of any real significance whatsoever, you're going to make people hot under the collar, and you're going to risk offending them. Okay, so what, you just stop talking about difficult things? And the answer to that is yes, and that's what's happening. But then there's another problem, which is there isn't anything I could conceivably say about anything that isn't going to offend someone if the crowd is large enough. So you might say, well, if you're talking to two people, you can't offend one of them. So you don't get to offend 50% of the population. It's like, okay, let's say I'm talking to 1,000 people, and one person finds what I'm saying offensive. Say, well, that's hateful. It's like, well, that's 1 in 1,000. So should I stop? What if it's 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 1,000,000? Like, where's the cutoff? And you might think, well, we'll work that out. It's like, no. You don't get it. The devil's in the details. You work it out now when you formulate your restrictions on free speech. You don't shunt that off into the future so that it's a problem that'll be solved. Who defines hate? Insoluble problem. Don't regulate it, because you can't define it.
Thank you.
Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like, you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
So you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me.
And that went viral. That made you very famous. Why do you think that sparked such a reaction?
Well, because I think that what I was saying was self-evidently true, but not expressed very well very often. I mean, look, most of the time when you're discussing something that needs to be discussed, everybody's actually rather upset about it. You know, if you're actually talking about something important, right? Because why talk otherwise, unless you're just shooting the breeze? But if there's an issue at hand that has to be discussed, then people are already upset, and they have different viewpoints, and the offensiveness in some sense is built into that. And you know that because if you have a family, if you have a wife, if you have an intimate relationship, and you're discussing something that's difficult, the probability that you're not going to offend each other if you're actually having the conversation is 0. And so you don't have to think unless you have a problem. And if you have a problem, then when you think, you're going to offend people. And so what, are we not going to think? That seems like a bad idea.
Yeah. You're obviously not an American. We love to not think. But you know, I used to do a show called Politically Incorrect back in the 90s, and oh, thank you. Oh, the 90s, we remember them. And so I was always asked, what is your definition of political correctness? And I had to come up with one. I said, it's the elevation of sensitivity over truth, which seems like what it still is, except it's worse than ever.
It's more like the elevation of moral posturing about sensitivity over truth. It's even worse.
Yeah. So where did it come from? How did we get to this place where we're so fragile? The safe space people.
Oh, I think that you can pretty much blame it on the universities. I think that they've pursued, especially in the humanities and in the social sciences as well, they've pursued a policy of a radical leftist policy with an overlay of postmodernism, which kind of a literary criticism approach that's produced all of this. As far as I can tell, I think you can lay a lot of it at the feet of faculties like the faculties of education. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education this week that just devastated the faculties of education, taking them to task for low academic standards and for possession by ideology and for basically indoctrinating people in a cult-like manner and playing identity politics and group identity.
And no free speech. They don't seem to. There was an incident in Fresno State. I don't know if you saw this, but Barbara Bush died. Okay, some professor there tweeted something nasty.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have tweeted it. She called Barbara Bush a racist and said she raised war criminals. Okay, you know, it's.
Yeah, well, the timing.
This crowd likes it, but I mean, it's nasty, and she's they're considering suspending her. And here's what the president of the university said. He said this was beyond free speech. This was disrespectful. Have we lost the thread back to knowing what free speech is? Yes, it can be disrespectful. That is covered under free speech. President of Fresno, you idiot! Jesus Christ!
Yeah. Well, and you see this too. I think where it's manifesting itself in a particularly appalling manner is in the increasing unwillingness of comedians, for example, to go on university campuses to be funny. And when comedians
I'm
start...
one of them.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, them. I'm not gonna... I call these people emotional hemophiliacs. You know, it's like the least little thing will make them start to bleed. But it makes me... because their answer is not to go into a room full of sharp objects. The answer is to make all of us wear bubble wrap.
Yeah, right.
So nothing we ever do makes them have a moment of discomfort.
Well,
It's
there's
really
also,
very narcissistic.
Well, there's also this idea that's promoted by the people who are protecting those who are easily offended, that the way to make people secure is to protect them from things that they don't want to encounter. And there isn't a clinician, like I'm a trained clinical psychologist, and there isn't a clinician in the country who's worth his or her salt that would ever make that claim. First of all, it's hard to make people safe because life is seriously not safe.
Yes.
And the way that you make people resilient is by exposing them to things that they're afraid of and that make them uncomfortable voluntarily, but you use exposure.
Right.
And and so, like, if you over-coddle people, if you protect them from everything that's sharp, you make them dull and stupid and narcissistic, and it's a really bad idea.
So you do know America. One thing I mean, your book is fantastic, and one of the rules that I really love is you say, don't let your kids do anything that would make you not like them. That's what I've been thinking for years when I call them the you mom generation. When I see kids, never in life because I never go near a child, but like on TV and movies, I see kids like saying you mom. And I'm like, if somebody who wasn't your child did that, you'd be immensely offended, whereas the parents just take it. What's up with that?
Well, people don't like to admit that they can dislike their children or children in general, and right. But they can.
No, they totally can.
One of the things you see very commonly as a clinical psychologist is family members who hate each other and who it's like they have their hands around each other's necks for 20 years and are squeezing very slowly, trying to strangle each other. And you see parents who clearly detest their children and have ever since they were born. And part of that, I know it's a terrible way of looking at things, but it's true.
It's so true.
And one of the things...
No, parents confide that in me because I don't have kids.
Yeah, well,
No.
that makes it safe.
They do.
But
no, but they say things like, yeah, I love my kids, but if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't.
Yeah, well, okay.
Like, well, don't tell the kid that.
Well, but that's so bad. Look,
it is so
it's
bad.
so bad because the thing is about little kids is that little kids have a wonderful element to them. And most people spontaneously like little kids, they'll give them a chance. And if you have little kids, one of the things that's so wonderful about it is that when you bring them out into the world, even people who aren't in good shape, rough people, and who maybe don't have much patience for humanity, it brings out the best in them, you know? And so people are willing to give your kids a chance. But then if they misbehave, especially if they're rude and they don't have any respect and they're whiny and they don't know how to listen, then people don't like your kids and you don't. And then your kids go out into a world where no one likes them. And that's what you do to your kids if you don't like them, is you send them out into that world.
But how did parents get so whipped?
Well, I think parents are afraid of exercising authority because they tend to think that authority will crush the creative spirit of their child.
Oh,
That is...
See, everything this man says, I think is common sense.
You guys might all need to know this. You're going to get mobbed on social media. Okay, so what do? Don't apologize, because then no one can come to your defense. I decided a long time ago, partly from reading Solzhenitsyn, that I was going to try to be very careful with my words, and I was only going to say things that I thought, well, to begin with, weren't lies, let's say. I was going to try to formulate my thoughts truthfully. And the reason I decided that was because I thought that the opposite was hellishly dangerous. And I really believe that. I truly believe that. And so if I say things and I think they're true and they get me in trouble, then I think, well, that's not as much trouble as I would have got into if I would have said something that wasn't true. Like, it might be more trouble right now. Who knows, right? Because, and you don't know how these things are going to turn out. And I had this interview, most of you know about it, with Kathy Newman from Channel 4, right? And that was a pretty strange experience. And, you know, she was pretty professional when we went to the studio, like someone like that is professional, kind of hard surface and glossy and media presentable, you know, the TV turns you into that. And she was perfectly polite in a professional way until the camera went on, and then, you know, and then she went after me.
You're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top, because that's what's skewing that gender pay gap, isn't it? You're saying, well, that's just a fact of life. Women aren't necessarily going to get to the top.
No, I'm not saying it doesn't matter either.
You're saying it's a fact of life.
There are multiple reasons for it.
So you were saying that by and large, women are too agreeable to get the pay rises they deserve.
No, I'm saying that that's one component.
But you're saying that makes them unhappy, by and large.
I'm saying no, I'm not saying that. And I actually haven't said that so far.
You're saying it makes them miserable.
And then the whole interview went the way it went, and I thought, I had like 20 interviews that day, and so I walked away from that, and I thought, oh God, they're going to take 7 minutes of that and, you know, broadcast it and make me look like a complete monster, and that'll be the end of that. And that is exactly what they did, except they also posted the entire thing on YouTube, not knowing at all that it was a train wreck. They had no idea. It wasn't like they thought, oh, well, this is a train wreck, we better put it on YouTube. It wasn't that at all. They thought it was a perfectly fine interview. So then it went on YouTube. And so like, my mood changed a lot. It was, first of all, well, this interview went catastrophically, and then it was, well, they're only going to use 7 minutes of it, and that's going to be a drag, but I'll probably get over it. And then they put it online, and then there was just an incredible reaction. And then 5-10 newspapers came out to play the victim card for poor Kathy, which was now all the online trolls were after her. And I thought, that really, really struck me. I thought, she's one of the most powerful people in the UK. You know, one of the 1,000 most powerful, let's say, or the 500 most powerful. She's no bloody victim. And she's paid plenty well for what she does. Well, then 10 newspapers played the victim card that poor Kathy was being trolled by, well, at that point, by like 1 million trolls. Who knew there were that many trolls? But apparently they were. And then I thought, well, God, the whole thing's going to go sideways again, because I'm going to come out of this as the villain who called forth, you know, the alt-right armada to take down poor, innocent Kathy Newman. And so it looked like it was going to shift that way for about 4 days. And then, well, that didn't work. There was a couple of other interviews that started to push back that narrative, and then it switched back to my side. But look, I'm making a point with this, is when I do an interview, like this interview, I follow this rule in my book. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Okay, so I come to an event like this, and I have an opportunity to say things, and I don't come in here and think, okay, here's a bunch of things I want to convince you of. You know, I don't care if you're convinced. It's not like I don't care about you, you know, in the sense that you care for people and hope the best for them, but I don't care if you're convinced. That's not what I'm here for. What I'm here for is to hear the questions and try to figure out what I think about them, and then to say that, and then to see what happens. Like, who the hell knows what's going to happen? If the world is properly constituted through truth, then faith is the willingness to have faith in truth. And so then you say what you believe to be true. And then some things happen. And sometimes they're not so good, which is why people often lie. You know, you tell the truth, you get in trouble for it. Every kid knows that. It's like, well, why'd you lie? Because I thought I'd get in trouble. Well, obviously. It's like, well, that's not a good long-term strategy. It's like, so you say what you believe to be the truth, and then you have the faith that no matter what happens, if you've said what you believe to be truth, whatever happens is the best thing that could have happened. And I believe that. I think that's how the world's constituted. And so it's not bravery, exactly. I would say it's more like faith. It's like, I'm going to say what I think. I'm going to try to do that as carefully as I possibly can. And I'm going to detach myself from the outcome. Because sometimes the outcome's terrible. I'm at McMaster University or Queen's, and there's like a bloody mob of zombies pounding on the window. You know, it's a little slice of hell. You think, this doesn't seem to be a very good idea. But, you know, the tide turns 2 or 3 times in the next 3 weeks and something comes out of it. And so if you're going to have faith in truth, it can't just be, well, did I get what I want in the next second? That's not faith. It's like, no, this is the other thing too that you got to understand, I think, is that without truth, you don't have the adventure of your life. You see, because if you tell the truth, that means you're revealing your being. That's what you're doing when you're telling the truth. When you reveal your being, then you're living in the world. That's you. That's your destiny. That's your journey. That's your adventure. That's what's going to justify your life. The adventure. It's not going to be easy. And if you hide from your truth, well, then you hide from yourself. And then you're not even there. And then who the hell are you? What are you? The puppet. You're the puppet of some coward. You're the puppet of some dictator or some second-rate philosopher, some idiotic idea or a bully you were afraid of in grade 6. God only knows. But it's not you living your life. And then you lose your life. And you lose your soul too. So that's what I'm afraid of. And so, you know, journalists, well, they try to take me down. It's like, yeah, well, that's annoying, and it usually takes me 3 days to recover. But compared to not having my life and not saying what I have to say, that's nothing. It's nothing. It's minor inconvenience. And then generally, if you can just withstand it, you know, 2 weeks, you get mobbed. You guys might all need to know this. You're going to get mobbed on social media. Okay, so what do? Unless you did something wrong. Don't apologize. That's the first thing, because then no one can come to your defense. So don't apologize. Maybe you even double down carefully, not vengefully, right? Carefully. You say, no, that's what I meant. And if you don't like it, too bad. And you get mobbed. Then you apologize, a different mob comes after you. That's not helpful, and no one can defend you. If you can hold out for 2 weeks, you'll win. Now, it's a pretty brutal 2 weeks, because, you know, if you're a reasonable person and 100 angry neighbors show up at your door with pitchforks, you might be thinking there's something wrong with you, you know, like you think that unless you're psychopathic. And you think, well, maybe I made a mistake. And it's easy to waver and to back down. And maybe you're also afraid. But, you know, if you scoured your conscience and you're careful and you said what you had to say, then leave it lie. And they'll throw, the people who are playing this game will throw everything they can at you for 2 weeks. And if it doesn't stick, you're done. And then the next time they try it, it doesn't work as well as it did the first time. And by the 50th time they try it, like as far as I can tell, carefully, the people who have enmity for me are out of ammunition. They're done. I read hit pieces now and I think, oh, you just copied the hit piece from 2 months ago. It's like, I'm perfectly habituated to that. They're out of ammunition. And maybe, you know, like someone creative could still come up with some more ammunition. Maybe that'll happen at the Q&A. But it's not bravery, man. It's faith in the redeeming power of truth, and that's different.